how's it going? Welcome back to my channel. Welcome back to my cave. My name is Jeff. Today I want to talk about Arthur Conan Doyle. Now, when most people think of Arthur Conan Doyle, if they think of him at all, they think about his creation, Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes, of course, the most famous, well-known, perhaps well-loved literary detective in history. And those stories are well worth reading. Arthur Conan Doyle is an excellent writer, but I don't want people to just stop there. A lot of people only think about Doyle in terms of his Sherlock Holmes stories, but he wrote so many different kinds of stories. He wrote essays, he wrote plays, he wrote nonfiction, he wrote historical adventure fiction, he wrote boxing stories, he wrote science fiction, and he also wrote a lot of horror and supernatural and creepy, fantastic stories. And those are the ones I'm here to talk about today. I don't want people to, I really highly encourage everyone to read Sherlock Holmes. Those stories, original stories, are great. Don't just stop at the Benedict Cumberbatch Sherlock or this new Amazon Prime series, Young Sherlock, or even, the older movies and TV series starring Basil Rathbone or Jeremy Brett, Peter Cushing. Lots and lots of great adaptations of the Sherlock Holmes stories out there, plus all the pastiche fiction and other mystery series or characters that were inspired by Sherlock Holmes. All that stuff's great. I highly encourage people to read those stories, but that's not what I'm here to talk about today. And I want people who are fond of weird fiction, horror fiction, fantastical fiction, speculative fiction, whatever you want to call it, to be aware that Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a lot of good stuff in that particular subgenre or those subgenres. And I'm going to talk a bit about some of the collections I have on some of those stories today. Now, there's a lot of overlap with the horror and supernatural stories. Now, I have 3 different books here. I think I have another one back home in the States, and there are many others that would work, but I'm going to show what I have here. So I'm going to put them in chronological order of publication that I own. I have this Pan book, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Tales of Terror and Mystery. Now, this is, as it sounds, split into 2 sections, Tales of Terror and Tales of Mystery. And of course, many of the Doyle's mystery stories, including the Sherlock Holmes stories, have elements of terror and supernatural elements, gothic horror, suspense elements involved in them, but they're not out and out supernatural stories. And of course, the Tales of Mystery in this one are very cool stories, but this one, for its Tales of Terror, it has 6 stories. It has The Horror of the Heights, which is my absolute favorite Doyle horror short story. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The Leather Funnel, The New Catacomb, The Case of Lady Sannox, The Terror of Blue John Gap, and The Brazilian Cat. Now, the thing about these books I'm going to show you is they don't all have the same stories. There's not like one perfect collection that collects everything that I've found so far. They either have, most of the most popular ones, but not others. Like this doesn't have Lot 249 or The Ring of Thoth or The Captain of the Pole Star, for example, and doesn't have The Bully of Brockus Court, etc. But let me talk about Horror of the Heights briefly. Horror of the Heights is a very cool and creepy story. Basically, it's like in the form of a diary. And so this one is about a pilot in the early days of aviation. And so the concept is this pilot is going up to explore, getting higher above the earth than pilots have generally gone at this stage. And he's going up to explore, but he's heard some weird tales, some strange stories of creatures living up there, and previous flyers who've tried this coming back down with their heads missing and crashing in the plane and their planes. And so he decides to go up and investigate and see if he can get his own beat the record for the highest flying altitude at this time. What he discovers is, to his horror and eventual fate, are some weird kind of balloon-like tentacled creatures that float up in this upper stratosphere and, take care of, feed upon anything that comes up in that area. So it's a very creepy and cool story. And it's one of those that are told from a journal that's found later after a certain sad event has befallen the narrator. Shades of H.P. Lovecraft, etc. I'm sure that Arthur Conan Doyle was extremely influential in mystery fiction, of course, with his Sherlock Holmes stories, but he also, I'm sure, was influential in his writings of horror stories and supernatural stories. Let's see, we could talk about a few of the others here. The Leather Funnel is about a young man who's engaged to an attractive young woman, and her very stern father warns him off. And how he does it is involving this leather funnel, which is an ancient torture device. This is kind of a story of evil reincarnated. It's quite an interesting tale. The Terror of Blue John Gap. This is another one that's written in the form of a kind of epistolary or letters format, and it's about a local doctor in Cornwall, I believe, who is convinced there's a giant monster, a weird giant beast living in this cave in Blue John Gap, and how what he encounters and what happens thereafter. That's very interesting and cool and creepy tale. And The Brazilian Cat. This is one about a man who visits his friend, and the friend's wife is from Brazil, and she takes a distinct dislike to the narrator, the visiting friend, and wants him out of the house, and how the friend of the narrator has a big black puma, a big black cat, the Brazilian cat of the title, in a cage, and somehow the narrator ends up in this cage, and what happens after that, and who put him there, etc. All those are really creepy tales. This book came out in 1978 from Pan Books. Now, all of these stories, of course, published way, way earlier by Arthur Conan Doyle. And I've had a lot of these books for quite a while. This is another one, a Dover edition. Dover put out these lovely, so many great collections of horror stories by the likes of Algernon Blackwood and Ambrose Bierce and M.R. James and Lord Dunsany, and they put out all sorts of mysteries. Dr. Thorndike by R. Austin Freeman, just a whole bunch of cool collections. And this is the best supernatural tales of Arthur Conan Doyle. Now, I don't think it can be called the best because it doesn't include Horror in the Heights, for one thing, but it does include a lot of other stories that weren't in that previous paperback volume that I showed you. So this has The Bully of Brockus Court. Now, this is a really fun story. Again, Arthur Conan Doyle was a fan of sports, cricket, boxing. He wrote, military stories. He wrote sea stories. He wrote so many different kinds of stories. And this is a ghostly boxing story. That's pretty cool, huh? So it's told from the point of view of a boxer, champion boxer, who gets in a kind of fight for his life, a boxing battle with a ghost of a famous boxer, and kind of a nasty piece of work that had terrorized a certain area at this Brockus Court area, this hall at Brockus Court. And the hero of the story goes one-on-one, mano-a-mano, with this ghost in a vicious boxing match. It's quite an interesting tale. Well done. We have The Captain of the Pole Star. Now, I believe several YouTubers, BookTubers, have talked about this one. This is kind of a dead of winter, Arctic exploration, maritime ghost story. The Pole Star is a vessel, and the captain decides to stop in the middle of the Arctic Sea, and there's a ghostly figure haunting the crew, and the crew want to get out of there before they get frozen in the ice, and their ship won't be able to move, but the captain's being erratic. Very interesting story. We have The Brown Hand. I covered this story on my channel at some stage in the past, and it's basically about a man a doctor who tries to help someone who's being haunted by a ghost. This is a former general, I believe, who spent a lot of time in India, and he's being terrorized by this ghost missing its hand, and how the main character helps lay the ghost, as they would say, gets rid of the ghost by making it satisfied so it can move on. The Leather Funnel, again, we talked about that story already. Lot number 249, I talked about this from my Mummy Story collection, Mummy Stories, which I talked about back in last May 2025, Horror Mayhem. It's a mummy tale, as you would expect in a mummy book. There's two mummy tales that Arthur Conan Doyle wrote involving, one is more horrific. Lot 249 is more horrific, with a kind of shambling, shuffling, creepy mummy that is used as a tool of vengeance to kill his enemies in the story. And the main character of Lot 249, what he does to turn the evil back on the person responsible. The Ring of Thoth, which is later in this book, is more of a kind of more kind of mystical tale, I suppose, where a man encounters, when he gets accidentally locked in the British Museum, the London Museum, at night, and encounters a strange man next to a mummy who's trying to do this ritual, bring back to life his love from the past, ancient Egypt's past. That's not a particularly scary story, just more of a weird, interesting story. We have J. Habakkuk Jepson's Statement. This is a story of a man who boarded this Marie Celeste, and this is Arthur Conan Doyle's, if anyone's familiar with the Marie Celeste, is the famous ship that was found abandoned, went missing. What happened to its crew. A lot of people did their version. A lot of writers have done their version of what happened to the crew. People found the ship, went on board. They found everything kind of in situ, like there was plates and food on the table and in the galley where people would eat, and it just looked like people abandoned ship suddenly for no reason. It's one of the famous mysteries in history. And in this tale, Arthur Conan Doyle gives a not, I don't want to say 100% supernatural, but kind of a weird version of what happened, and from the supposed last man who had been on this ship, giving his statement. We have the Great Kind Plots Experiment, which is kind of a more lighthearted tale, I suppose, of mind transference between two bodies. Two professors, I think, or the two main characters in this book switch their minds, and have some kind of antics ensue, and they're able to switch them back. A Literary Mosaic, I don't know much about. I haven't read that one. The Los Amigos Fiasco is, again, there's some kind of tall tales, American tall tales here. John Barrington Cole's is a story, kind of a man who gets involved with, I guess you could say, a kind of the recurring Black Widow sort of character, although it's not the typical Black Widow who's just murdering her husbands for wealth. This is a woman, John Barrington Coles gets involved with an attractive but mysterious woman whose previous fiancés have all died. The friend of Cowles, the narrator, is trying to find out information about this woman and her father, because his friend is obviously a little distraught because of some things he's found out. And turns out that the father of this girl is involved with devil worship, and the narrator whisks John Barrington Cowles away to a remote Scottish island to kind of get away from the evil influence of this young lady, but that influence is hard to shake. We have The American's Tale in this, the final story in this, which is about a killer giant Venus flytrap and taking somebody out. So lots of interesting stories in that one. And again, I have one more collection here. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, The Horror in the Heights and Other Stories. This is a much more modern book, 2010. I'm trying to remember where I got this. I might have picked this up at Barnes & Noble or something. It's a nice little hardback. And it's got this interesting kind of, I guess, little spider web motif at the top of each page there, which could be distracting for some people, but this has an introduction as well, and then it gets to, this might be the most well-rounded of the collections. It has The Horror in the Heights, of course. It concludes with that story. It has The Captain of the Pole Star, John Barrington Coles, The Great Kind Plots Experiment, The Ring of Thoth, or Thoth, Lot number 249, the aforementioned mummy stories, those two, The Case of Lady Sannox. Now, The Case of Lady Sannox is, I guess it's horrific, but it's more of a crime story, I suppose. Basically, a doctor, starts an affair with Lady Sannox, who's married to a much older man who everyone thinks he's too clueless to catch on. But no, he's not. It's kind of a tale of revenge for extramarital affairs. So we have The Parasite. Now, I'm not overly familiar with The Parasite. The Brazilian Cat I mentioned, The Brown Hand, Playing with Fire, The Leather Funnel again, The Silver Mirror. So there's several of his horror stories I haven't read. The Terror of Blue John Gap, and The Horror of the Heights. So this one has a lot of the big ones, I'd say. But again, none of these three have everything. So each one has some, stories that are missing from other collections. Again, I haven't read all of Arthur Conan Doyle's horror stories, supernatural stories, ghost stories, terror stories, etc. But I can heartily recommend of the dozen or so that I have read. They are really good and really varied and very interesting. Some are more creepy than others. He can be, creeperific. Leather Funnel is and Horror of the Heights is really creepy, scary, with some outstanding monsters, and really well put together. And they can be just more, kind of brief encounters that the narrator manages to have survived and relate to tell the tale of their scary and crazy adventures. Now, before I end this video, I do want to talk briefly about one of Conan Doyle's really famous characters, maybe second only to Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is by far more famous and well known, but some people do know Professor Challenger. Now, Professor Challenger is Doyle's kind of science fictional character, I guess you could say. I mean, Doyle was writing at the very beginnings of science fiction, and so, they're probably science fiction fantasy more like, I suppose. And these Professor Challenger stories, one of them gets into the more supernatural and spiritualistic vein, as did Doyle later in his life especially. So, of course, I think people have heard of The Lost World. There's been some movies done about it. I'm not counting the Jurassic Park sequel, The Lost World, but of course there were movies. There was a silent film version. There was a 60s version. I think there was a made-for-TV version in the 90s. Lost World is a fantastic story of Professor Challenger, who's this big, burly, bearded, irascible genius of a scientist, and he leads an expedition down to Maple White Land, this plateau in the Amazon, very similar to real-life plateaus that have been discovered there since, such as the ones depicted in the Pixar movie Up. So on this remote plateau, dinosaurs, ape men still exist, and that's a fantastic adventure story. Highly, highly recommend that. I believe that was written in 1910 or 1911, and that's not the only one. It's the most famous one and the most widely read of those kind of stories featuring Professor Challenger, but he wrote another novella and another novel and two more short stories, all featuring Professor Challenger. So the same characters from The Lost World, which included, of course, Professor Challenger and his kind of rival frenemy, Professor Summerlee, and then Malone, the newspaper reporter who is the narrator of these stories, and Sir Lord John Roxton, big game hunter, calm under pressure. Those four are the main characters, and with the, co-starring Professor Challenger's his wife, who's able to calm down some of his more fiery temper tantrums that he goes into when anyone decides to, doubt his scientific wisdom. Anyway, we have for the novella or extended novelette, it's maybe kind of in between the two lengths of those, we have The Poison Belt, which is, I believe, some kind of meteor falls to Earth or something. Some belt in space comes close enough to the Earth to seemingly poison and kill a bunch of people, and how Professor Challenger and his friends deal with this situation, and what happens, basically a close call on Earth. Then we get into the much later novel, The Land of Mist, and this one is, Doyle just goes off the deep end into spiritualism in this one, and any kind of trace of science is, kind of surface level at best, but it's a very interesting story. So, and then we have two really cool short stories, The Disintegration Machine and When the World Screamed. And all of those are contained in this. This is a Wordsworth Classics, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, The Lost World and Other Stories. And I believe this one, there are many versions that collect these stories, but this one was published in 1995. I think this is a reprinting, of course, because I certainly didn't buy it that long ago, I don't think. Well, maybe I did, because that's doesn't show any other date. Anyway, just a final note on When the World Screamed. This is a really cool story. This is some Challenger calls or somehow contacts his friend, the newspaper man Malone, and tries to get him to come and witness what's going on. He's vehemently opposed to this mining experiment where they're drilling into the center of the Earth. And you can imagine that the Earth is not so happy about that, as you can tell from the title of that story, When the World Screamed. So that's some of a brief overview of Arthur Conan Doyle's fantastical or supernatural fiction, short fiction, mostly, with some other novels. It's not a Professor Challenger novel, but there is another cool underwater kind of lost world adventure story called a novel called The Maracot Deep, which I can also heartily recommend. I mean, Doyle's just a really great writer and well worth reading. His historical novels like Sir Nigel and the White Company, or Rodney Stone, historical boxing story. So much good stuff worth reading that is not involving Sherlock Holmes. Now, again, I highly recommend Sherlock Holmes stories. I definitely would like you to read those if you haven't. Please give them a try. They're great, but it's not the only thing worth reading by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I didn't even get to the Brigadier Gerard stories, the kind of humorous, tall tale, military adventure stories. The guy just wrote tons of stuff. It's worth investigating. So if you have time, dig into his bibliography, and I hope you find something you enjoy. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I will see you in the next video. Take care and happy reading.